The panel will be led by Daniël Lakens. Daniel is Associate Professor in the Human Technology Interaction Group at Eindhoven University of Technology. And his areas of expertise include meta-science, research methods, and applied statistics. And one of the things he has done is that he convinced the Dutch Research Council to start a pilot project with grants dedicated to replication research in 2018. So Brian, please go ahead. The floor is yours, together with Dorothy and with Brian.
All right. So if I listen to both these talks, then Dorothy mentioned a lot of about the importance of this less groundbreaking work and more building up certain things. And I think the success that Brian mentions in his talk is mainly about registered reports, which are strongly associated with this last confirmatory step where you really demonstrate the end result, and it's very good for that part. How is this related to doing more of this building work that needs to be done, and where do the incentives come from to do that kind of work, even in the proposals that have been set? Because that seems to be the real issue that needs to be improved. Is there any idea of how this can be incentivized?
I don't see it as an either or. I mean, I try and pre-register what I do, and quite a few of the studies I do, I actually have as registered reports. And I don't know how far Brian, clarified for people not so clear about that distinction. I mean, you explained what a registered report was. I think a lot of people think it's the same thing as pre-registering, but you can pre-register without being a registered report, basically. Being a registered report is that you actually get it peer reviewed and then an in principle acceptance. And that's much harder. It's much more work. But I mean, I just think like everything should be incremental. So I do a study. I always think the study is going to be like the definitive statement in the area. So I do the study, and then at the end of it, I realize it's not the definitive statement, and so we need to do more. So I think it's not that you set out to be incremental. It's that you set out to do the best study you can, that you hope will move you quite a long way along, but it never is the last word. And you should then be able to decide to do another study to take it that step further, or for other people to build on what you've done in a way that is, as I say, fairly filling in the gaps and making sure it's solid before you sort of rush off and do something else. But I think all of this can be done. It will be done to higher quality if it's done in the format of a registered report. I don't know whether you were also intimating what about just sort of exploratory research, which that's also very important. The idea that we should just, before we commit ourselves perhaps to a hypothesis, you might want to just sort of scan the landscape. And again, I've been having fun looking at careers of Nobel laureates to sort of try and make, because they make all the points that one wants to make, really, that this is how they work. Quite often they don't start off with a clear hypothesis. They do have a phase of exploring what's going on and noticing things even by accident. But then when they do home in, they are starting to do a series of experiments which build on one another and sort of converge to a conclusion. So I don't see it as a sort of either or. I think a good scientist does exploratory research, does more hypothesis testing research, but if you're doing the hypothesis testing stage, it's often a series of studies. It's the sort of vision that I think a lot of people have, is that the only thing to do is to get something into a top journal and then you move on and do something else. It's having a mindset that's more cumulative, but that is limited these days by short-term funding. A lot of people get 3 years funding, and they're already applying for the next lot of funding before they finish what they started on. So I think that's the other structural thing that counts against us, is the very short-term funding available to most people early in their career.
Yeah, I would just add that it's very hard to plan for a surprising outcome, because they're surprising. It's sort of we don't know what's going to happen. So where we actually get those truly groundbreaking and new direction kinds of findings are when things go awry from what our initial plans were. And so I think that is not I don't see any threat, agreeing with Dorothy, I don't see any threat in these different models for encouraging that, unless people feel like by pre-registering or by doing a registered report, that means I can't or shouldn't explore that data. That would be a bad outcome if people feel that constraint. So in my lab, we register basically everything, but we do tons of exploratory work. So in many of those where even we have a hypothesis in advance, right, we'll test what we said we planned from the outset. And then once that's done, we open the box and say, let's see what's in here. Oh my gosh, look at all this stuff, right? And all of that exploration of the same data then helps to inform the next step, the next direction. And sometimes we go, 90 degrees from where we thought we were going because of what's discovered along the way. So I think this kind of system, both publication system and pre-registration itself, is very amenable to that, because really all it's doing is documenting planning. That's its sole purpose, pre-registration, is documenting what the plans were, what I thought before, what I found now, so that it's really clear to me and to you how that emerged.
But also don't underestimate, I think, the value of having peer review at a point in the process.
Oh yeah.
It's helpful. So I mean, the real problem with peer review at the moment is it comes in at a stage when it's really too late usually to do much to improve your design, at least. And it's often a very negative experience, and people will bend things in order to try and please the reviewers. I found it much more constructive with with a registered report, where you put in your analysis plan and your ideas, and then you get actually constructive criticism, and you often improve the study.
Yeah. And I think there's an important difference between innovative outcomes and innovative questions. Yeah. I think it's all right for us to be promoting innovative questions on things where we're saying, this really would be an exciting thing to try to figure out next. And register reports is very amenable to that, right? If others agree, wow, that really is an important question. It'd be exciting to find out what happens there. I don't think it'll work, but it's still exciting, because if it did, da, 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 da. Right? Whereas the outcomes is by putting that emphasis of novelty and innovation on the outcomes. That's what we're not supposed to be able to control. And that's what we can't really plan for. Those just happen.
So in this publication process and funding process, there are a lot of these different parties. In my experience, a lot of people keep pointing to each other whose responsibility something is. So the funder might say, no, we're more than happy to fund whatever you submit to us. And if that is incremental research, we will fund that. But that's not what we're getting submitted in grants. And then, everybody's sort of pointing to each other. I was wondering, where do you think, especially with these incentives for this more, let's say, robust incremental work, who's responsible?
Well, the two quotes I had from funders show that the funders are emphasizing the groundbreaking stuff, or have been, at least two big funders. And there was one of my colleagues in Oxford, Ian Chalmers, had a campaign against the Wellcome Trust. And the Wellcome Trust is in general a good guy. They are, as a funder goes, they are very innovative themselves and very keen to sort of adapt and change. But there was this, he was outraged because they just wouldn't, for example, fund systematic reviews because they thought it was boring, it's old stuff. Whereas Ian's view as a medic in clinical trials was that they were absolutely essential to do and to do well. And they of course cost money and time, but that it was what we were ending up with was a lot of waste, with people doing studies that didn't need doing because we already knew the answer. But had they done a systematic review first, we would have found out. So he would argue that I've certainly sat on grant panels where things, and I've had my own work sometimes criticized, because it's only a replication. It's more of the same. When I'm feeling I've only started scratching the surface of something, and certainly most people I know feel when they put in a new grant proposal that they've got to have something other, they can't just say, well, we've got this far along in this process and we want to just carry on. That would be seen as boring. So I think the funders genuinely are to blame there. And of course they are so swamped with proposals. They're always, even the ones with a high rate are funding only a small proportion of what's submitted to them. So I think this has emerged perhaps as a criterion that will discriminate between grants, but it's perhaps not the optimal one for good science.
Yeah, the challenge is that none of us have control and all of us have responsibility, right? That's the nature of the coordination problem, is that each of our actions can sustain or challenge the status quo and the way that the research culture operates. And so funders rightly say, well, geez, we set up these mechanisms and then the reviewers said, no, we want innovation. And that's the researchers. Like, what are we supposed to do? We can't just override our reviewers. But of course, there are parts of the process that the funder can control. There are parts of the process that individual researchers can control and what they submit and how they review. But everybody is looking at each other because they know that no one alone can change the system. And so, that can be very dispiriting because it just leads to inaction. And the only way out of it is for individuals to take ownership of the things that they can act on and to make it visible. And if you make it visible, then the others that are in your near neighbors will say, oh, I thought that too. I've been worried about that. And then they make it visible. And that's how you get network effects, right? Is that if you're advancing things that other people do agree with, they just don't feel like the culture supports it, then you can collectively start to address what is that coordination problem. The funder starts to explicitly say, we want to really embrace incrementalism. Saying it isn't enough because the reviewers are going to do what they do. But they could say, you know what, reviewers, we'd like, we're going to send back your review. And you know what, we didn't actually want you to review on this. We wanted you to review on that. So could you remove that part or address it? So it takes work, but then they say, oh, wow, you really meant that? Okay, well, yeah, sure, I'm on board, whatever.
As there's this increase in, let's say, rigor or raising the bar a little bit about how certain things go. Now the focus is on things like open data and materials, which we can see. So you can just check it's there. At a certain moment, it will have to also encompass things like better methods, better measurements. Is it easy enough to identify these qualities also for peer reviewers that we can select on the better work beyond the clearly visible, you have it, you don't, and who's responsible for that? Journals check this, should peer reviewers do it? Or
I think that has to be peer reviewers, because I think it's not going to be a simple metric. It's going to be probably quite field specific. And so you want somebody who is in that area and knows it. But I mean, again, I think there have been some quite telling examples where for years people have been using measures that are inadequate to the purpose. So that this has been pointed out, for example, in studies with fMRI, they're often using measures that in terms of psychometrics have no, the retest reliability might be 0.3, 0.4. So they are measures that from one occasion to another, the same person might look very different on. And certainly I'm moving to the position of saying people have to, first of all, demonstrate retest reliability. If they're looking at individual differences, it's an important aspect of any measure that you use. But it comes down again then to training, and that people are not trained, I think, to understand that stuff. If you come from more of a sort of physiology background, it's foreign to you. If you come from a clinical psychology background, it's much more something you're familiar with. So I think there are things like that one can sort of have as a sort of, I suppose you could have a checklist of, how much do we know about the sensitivity of this measure, its reliability, and things like that. It would be possible to devise some sort of list that would be fairly generic. But very often, I think, I find if I'm stray outside my own particular area, it's hard to know what to make of measures because they're so specific to the subject area.
Yeah, you are calling out what I think is helping illustrate that this is it's a really hard problem. Transparency is the easy part because it's just, did you share it or not? The hard part is the actual gut substance of the research. Are these valid measures? Do you have a good theoretical conceptualization? Are you testing it in a way that actually gives some diagnostic evidence? Ultimately, that is what research training and research activity is working on constantly, all of the time, is questioning our measures and our validity and our theories and everything else. So what I see as the nature of the problem to solve is not to say, okay, let's just make everybody great theorists. Of course, we want everybody to be great theorists, but let's set the conditions. If we're thinking of this as a structural problem, let's set the conditions that will allow the community to get better at measurement, theory, validity, et cetera. And the conditions that are needed for that is transparency. The challenge of lack of access to data or the materials or lack of incentives for replication and all of these things is that we don't actually know how we think we know the things that we think we know. A lot of no's there. Okay, well, nevertheless, all of that makes it hard to actually self-correct, to actually build on evidence, to actually question and interrogate the validity of measures, because I don't know how you got to where you got to, and you don't know how I got to mine. And so that really is the seedbed will change how it is that people start to, I think ultimately what transparency will do if we adopt it at scale is it will help us with our overconfidence. And if we just fix that, boy, what a change that would be, right? Is to recognize how weak our evidence is for the claims that we want to make. And that's not to say that we're bad researchers because we have weak evidence. We're studying hard things. That's fine. That's how it is, right? I don't understand this phenomenon yet. And I'm well calibrated in how poorly I understand it. So boy, what an exciting thing for me to keep working on.
I actually think also perhaps a brilliant example going away from psychology is what you did in cancer biology, where you were doing replication of studies in cancer biology and found that you couldn't actually even redo the studies because the accounts of the methods were unclear, or you couldn't get the reagents. I mean, I thought that was very telling that in that field, things seem so much worse than psychology because you couldn't get, I mean, at least in psychology, you can usually get the description and then more or less do what you think was done in the paper. But in those studies, I got the impression that a high percentage of them, it was impossible to reproduce what the people had done because it was not clearly specified and the protocol was unclear or the materials and reagents were not available. So I think that's something that could certainly be cleaned up.
That's right.
Maybe a last question. Dorothy mentioned some differences between fields, that apparently it's really tough in economics to get into one of these 5 journals. I also had to think of fields like mathematics, where they've had preprint servers for a very long time and don't seem to be too upset wherever it gets published in a while. Do you have some ideas of, and we mentioned the humanities before that have different rules. So how do you think that these differences between fields actually emerge? And is there something we can learn from that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'm really pleased about our Reproducible Research Oxford is that we're trying to do this across all divisions of the university. So we want to include everyone. But it's clear that on the one hand, there are massive differences between fields in what the key problems are. So I remember naively early on, somebody said to me in sort of biomedical sciences that there was a big problem with these images that people use in papers and that some of them were dodgy in various ways. And I thought that was really sort of a rather niche idea. And of course, it's massive that these are often fraudulent. And similarly, they were saying, well, the integrity of reagents is very, very important. And again, I thought, well, that's a bit sort of, a minor topic. And it's huge because what happens is people think they're working with one reagent, and actually if you then bother to check it, it's something else because you get something from some lab, it's not necessarily what you think it is. So those sorts of problems are not going to be so much an issue for people like psychologists and sociologists and so on, but we have our own issues. I think we have particular problems with gardens or forking paths, and so any domain that uses a lot of statistics has issues with p-hacking and so on. But I think we're all different, but on the other hand, it's very, very useful to compare and contrast. And sometimes you find you can learn from another area how to solve some of these problems, or which ones are well dealt with in some fields. And I mean, I'm impressed with clinical medicine because they've learned a lot about how to, do things, how to use methods, how they don't have problems so much with power. They tend to know what they're doing more statistically, but they still complain that there's huge problems with outcome switching and people are not actually doing what they said they were going to do, even though they have registered trial registries. But I felt we learned a lot from them. They're interestingly now sort of coming back and sort of looking at what psychology is doing and saying, we still have problems with p-hacking and so on.
Yeah, I agree. There's enormous opportunity for translation. The siloing has meant that different problems emerge in different ways across communities. And there's always the potential that there will be lack of transmissibility, like it doesn't correspond. But many of the issues that get talked about on these are very at the abstract level are the same thing, right? But it's when you get down into concrete, how it manifests, where the differences are. And so the interesting meta research conversations that I think occur are, okay, I see how this plays out for you, economist. Let's see is there a corollary in cell biology that we can learn something from to take what you're now doing there and test it over here. And in having been in many of these conversations, I have yet to find one where there isn't opportunity for one community to learn from another on improving some things, because Dorothy's right. There are some places where things shine and do really well, and other places they don't. Economics, as an example, those leading journals have really strong standards for sharing data and code.
Yeah,
really strong. And that's I think making a big difference in that field on that part of it. You know, the reward structure, oh boy, that's a mess. But they're doing great on data sharing and code.
Yeah. I was quite surprised when I looked at them for exactly that reason. I think the real problem with them, of course, is that they have become so non-innovative because they've just got these same sorts of people publishing in the same sorts of journals. And it is, there have been real complaints that the theoretical development has really sort of shriveled up or become very much everybody thinking the same way because they don't have sufficient diversity in the way they publish.
All right, thanks so much. I'll give the word back to Peter to round up Kurt, sorry.
No problem. Thank you, Daniel. Yeah. First of all, I would like to thank our wonderful speakers, Dorothy Bishop and Brian Nosek, for their insights, their expertise, also their optimism and drive. So we will definitely need that also. Yeah. Thanks also to our expert moderator, Daniël Lakens. And I would also like to thank Elsevier for the support of this seminar series and the wonderful collaboration we've had setting this up. So thank you, Michiel Koolman and Sharon Duurmeijer. And then from Leiden University Libraries, I would like to thank Lauren Seesink, Peter Verhaar, Christina Hetne, Casper van Omme, and Ben Compagne for all the work they have done to develop the seminar series. And then, dear participants, thank you for attending this seminar. We look forward to seeing you possibly next week for our second seminar. The registration for the second and third seminars are still open, so make use of them. And then, yeah, goodbye from Leiden University. We hope you will have a safe and healthy day and the rest of the week and months, and have a nice and relaxing day or evening wherever you are. Bye-bye to everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.